sort of back to the discussion I had with Representative Mickey Edwards. He's a fan of abolishing these structural mechanisms that parties have put in various states, and say, that restrict who can run, and if they've lost the primary, they can't run in the general election. Is that something you would support, or do you have another mechanism in mind to mitigate the problems you're identifying?
I think it's hard to get from here to there, but I do think that moving in the direction of, for congressional elections, of more open primaries followed by ranked choice voting could really be a way to get the incentives closer to right when it comes to members of Congress. So if the top 5 vote getters, regardless of party in the primary, are on the election day ballot, and the winner is chosen by ranked choice voting, everybody has an incentive to try to be the second choice of as many people as possible. And in a way, that's what we should want of our politicians. Certainly, they have their views and they have their voters, but they should want to also appeal to people who are not intensely with them on everything, but who will say, well, she's a good person and she's someone I trust. Having that kind of incentive prevents you from going all the way to the edges of your party coalition, and keeps you focused on the broader interest of the district, the state, ultimately the country. And so I do think it's worth experimenting with electoral reform in that way that gets us beyond the strict party primary for House and Senate seats. I just think that is an experiment that has failed utterly. And, it's not easy to get beyond it. It's not easy to make the case against it, but I think it's important to try.
So if we go back to the notion of incentives in Congress itself, I mean, obviously they have their direct constituencies if they've got, their own Twitter feeds and their own social media accounts, but also a lot of what shapes their incentives is what the media reports on. So can you talk a little bit about the media and what incentives it's creating, and what pathologies it's creating in Congress because of that incentive structure?
Yeah, I think it's important to see that the driving force when it comes to political journalism has been the fragmentation of the mainstream media over the past generation or so. So that rather than being filtered through a small number of mainstream institutions, political news now gets filtered through a much larger number of more explicitly partisan media organs. And that means that members have an incentive to speak to their most intensely polarized voters through the medium of journalistic forums that reward and value polarized political speech. Essentially, members have to constantly convey the view that the other party is the country's biggest problem. That's what everybody wants to hear. That's what everybody wants to see you doing. And you have to be seen to be fighting and making the other party, driving the other party crazy. That's not entirely new, don't get me wrong. There's always been that kind of, there's always been an element of polarization and appealing to voters, but the nature of political media now means that there is a kind of, there's a kind of cycle of intensification of that sort of political polarization. And there's much less reward for being the guy who works out the compromise infrastructure bill. You have to have a lot of confidence in your seat, in your coalition back home. You got to be 6 years away from an election, or the Republican in Utah, where you're never going to lose in a million years, to be able to do that. And without question, the media environment has a lot to do with that.
And so how can that change, or can it? Is it something where, it's just a temporary thing, and eventually a lot of these platforms will reconsolidate, and you'll have 20 years from now, we'll have the, 4 media outlets again. Yeah. Do you think this is just a temporary situation for media, or is this something that we have to address in some other fundamental way to counter?
Yeah, I think there is something to that argument. And you can look at a kind of cycle of this sort, where if you look at the political media environment, say in the early American Republic at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, it looked a lot like this. Very low barriers to entry, resulting in a massive number of extremely partisan political organs. The Arkansas Democrat Gazette is called that because it was literally created by the Democratic Party as a way to convey whatever news they wanted to reach their voters. The Illinois Republican. So I think we've seen that, and economic pressures basically drove consolidation. Now, it's not obvious how that's going to happen now, but I do think that there's a basic problem in the contemporary political media environment, which is that there are essentially no viable business models. Very few people are making money. I don't think that's sustainable. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you sustain it without it either becoming basically a philanthropic endeavor where donors are supporting journalistic work, or some different business model forms around some other way of using advertising or subscription or something else that allows this to survive, to flourish. That's how markets work. I tend to think that where we're going to land isn't going to be where we are, because there has to be a functional business model, but I don't know what it is. And so I wouldn't say that I'm confident that it'll be consolidated rather than fragmented. I do think that this is a phase, that this is leading somewhere. And I, for one, don't have a clear picture of where that is. So to the extent that media drives political incentives, which is an enormous extent, the evolution of political media is going to be enormously important to the future of our politics.
So if we go back to the notion of incentives then for the institution, I mean, one of the things that you've talked about is, this idea of looking at Congress as a platform for self-promotion, and which is essentially putting yourself above the Congress, right? The idea of yourself is superior, or the idea of your party is superior to this notion of the institution of Congress. You're putting yourself above the Congress.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental incentive problem. What do we need to do to create the incentive the other way around, where you put Congress above self as a member, you put Congress above party?
So I think you have to start from the premise that these are ambitious people who are going to want to put their success first. And the question is, how do you invest that ambition into Congress as an institution rather than into their partisan identity or their personal brand? And I think the answer to that has to involve some institutional change in the Congress, so that the question, what is it worth my time to do? The answer to that is less about how to get on cable news and more about how to achieve something legislatively that you then can get credit for. I think that involves in part some of what we've talked about in terms of changing the logic of the committee work and their structure, giving committees more control, floor time, giving them some more ability to move things on their own. I think it's also very important to think about changes to the budget process. The budget is at the center of Congress's work. In some ways, it always has been. The modern budget process, which was created in the 1970s, was designed for a Congress, basically a one-party institution. It was designed for a Congress run by the Democratic Party, in which Republicans have some interest in advancing their ideas, but don't expect to ever be in power. And that's how Congress was for a long time. Since the mid-1990s, and Francis Lee is really the best voice on this, Congress has been going back and forth. And the budget process we have is extremely poorly suited for this kind of narrow partisan majorities. And I think we have to think very fundamentally about how to change the budget process in a way that could better invest members in their legislative work. For example, I think that eliminating the distinction between authorization and appropriation, a bill that makes law and a bill that spends money, would be enormously important, so that the work that happens in most of the committees, which are authorizing committees, would actually spend public money, would be the way in which Congress uses its power of the purse. That distinction is not in the Constitution. Congress doesn't have to work this way. And to think creatively about that, I think offers you some opportunities to empower members to elevate themselves as legislators rather than as political performers. To me, those are the kinds of changes we should look for.
Yeah, I had a great conversation with Alan Schick a few weeks back as well, who's his whole career is dedicated to this budget question, and he's unfortunately quite pessimistic after all of his attempts to look at reforming that process. But in terms of splitting appropriations and authorizations, there's a logic there. You think that it doesn't make sense necessarily. It doesn't have to be that way. So it sounds like your prescription is to spread spending power more widely in the Congress.
Yes, that's right.
Give more members a stake in the game of negotiating over real money.
Exactly. To give more members more of a stake and to break that very consolidated budget process, which has come down almost literally to one big vote a year, into ongoing legislative work that matters day by day, because that's in fact how Congress ends up both making laws and spending money. Right now, a lot of the work that members are called to do as legislators just actually doesn't matter. They're not being irresponsible by ignoring it. It doesn't matter. It's going to be overwhelmed by whatever bills the leadership decides on at the end of the process. If it mattered more, they would devote more time to it. That's the nature of incentives.
I mean, the nice thing about appropriations type of decisions is that their magnitude in their decision structure, right?
That's right.
You're deciding a number, and that number is infinitely variable, right? And
it's
so
ideal for bargaining, right? You can say, I want this much, you want that much. If you're talking numbers, there's something in the middle.
Right. Whereas for a lot of other kinds of decisions are binary, right? They're values-based decisions, potentially, where there is no middle ground. Yeah. And so in those non-middle ground kind of categories, how do you come to agreement? Is it just the brute force majority, or is it some other mechanism?
Well, it's a challenge. I mean, I think it's important to develop a culture of bargaining where you're used to talking to people and working with people from the other party and saying you get some and I get some. But there's no easy way. I don't have a prescription for how Congress could, say, negotiate over, abortion. That's never going to be easy. And it's probably not something that belongs in Congress ultimately for that reason. But I think a lot of the work that Congress is called upon to engage in looks more like a kind of traditional, bargaining-oriented legislative work where there's a public problem, there are different ways to address it. There's some middle ground to be had, and ultimately you can arrive at a bill that's supported by a strange-looking cross-partisan coalition. Nobody's perfectly happy, but everybody's achieved something. That kind of accommodation, to me, is what success looks like in a democratic legislature.
One question I have on decisions always fascinates me as it relates to Congress is this notion of time, right? And externalities, really. I mean, you have this Congress today, they're elected for 2 years or for 6 years for senators. And they're making decisions that can bind external parties, future voters that don't have as much to say in the current Congress under their current notions of representation. Yeah. So, one thing I talked to Alan Schick about is this kind of, is there a different kind of decision structure that needs to be embraced when you're making decisions that have much longer term liabilities? Right. So simple majorities for something that is born today versus, super majorities for things that bind the grandkids, and I guess there's been attempts to balance budget amendments that try to do this type of thing. But I'm curious on your opinion on this, whether there's a real distinction between these types of decisions and whether they should have a different mechanism.
It's a very interesting question, because Congress in some ways has gone in the other direction, which is they've empowered simple majorities to make spending decisions, which are ultimately also borrowing decisions, which impinge the freedom of action of future generations more than almost anything Congress does, and has allowed those to be simple majority decisions, while everything else Congress does, at least could require a supermajority in the Senate. That's been done in part because spending decisions just have to be made. Otherwise, there's paralysis, and the budget process looks for ways to make sure that it avoids paralysis. I certainly think there are ways to try to prioritize and think about the things that matter most in the long run and look for ways to make sure those are addressed. In a democratic society, and this has certainly been true in American life, those kinds of issues are especially hard for Congress to focus on. The issues where the problem to be solved is a long-term problem that isn't going to show itself within the next 2 years or 6 years are issues that we just put off. We don't deal with them, whether that's the fiscal trajectory of the federal budget, whether it's climate change, things where if we don't do anything, there'll be a problem someday, but not on election day, are the least likely to get addressed. And I certainly think it's worth looking for ways to help those be taken up, but I don't know that we've seen a good formula for doing it.
All right, so I think it's time for us to move on to our common questions we ask all our guests. We've already addressed some of them, and I'll ask you to rehash your feelings on those questions if you don't mind. But if you're ready, we'll move on to those.
Sure.
All right, the first one is something I just mentioned, which is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I would say that representation is not a simple matter. Congress isn't simply representative. We're asking, in a sense, members are charged with making decisions on our behalf, not simply doing what I would do if I were in Congress, but showing me that I can trust them to make careful judgments in the national interest and in the interest of the district or the state. And so I think representation doesn't have to look like simple majoritarianism. Ultimately, Congress exists to enable large public problems to be resolved through accommodation and bargaining. And that doesn't look like direct representative majoritarianism. There have to be mechanisms in the system to compel and to enable that process of accommodation. And I think our Congress sees that. It's designed with that in mind. It isn't doing an ideal job of it now, but I think there's a reason for the counter-majoritarian forces in the design of the institution, and I'd like to see those reinforced.
So I know you're a big Burke fan. So it sounds like that you believe that representatives should make their own judgments on policy matters, and that they're not just a window into the beliefs of their constituency.
I do, and that, they're accountable for those judgments. That famous line of Burke's that the member of parliament isn't simply a delegate but owes his voters his judgment, less frequently told is that Burke lost the next election. He said that in a speech to his voters, and they were not impressed. You are accountable for what you do, but I think that's right. You owe people your judgment, and not simply and not simply a window into their will.
And it sounds like your opinion is that it's the whole district or the whole state, not just the party, the majority, or the primary voters that matter. It's you're representative of the entire constituency. Is that right?
Yeah, look, I think that cliche that politicians say after they win an election, that that they want to represent everyone, including people who voted against them. It's not always easy to do that, but I think to the extent they can, that actually should be their goal. Absolutely.
And what about future generations that will live in that district? I'm going to give you a harder question, since you've thought it through more than a lot of others, which is, future generations are not voting. We don't know what their opinions are, their beliefs are, their needs are. Does the member represent them, or is he representing his current constituents, and those current constituents embody those future needs?
Yeah, look, I think the best we can do on that front is work so that the society we have is worthy of being passed along to that next generation, is a worthy inheritance for them. We can't know exactly what they will need, let alone what they will want, but we do know what the difference between a thriving and a failing society is. And one of the reasons we should want our society to thrive, aside from, of course, wanting our own lives to flourish, is wanting that next generation to flourish. And, I think a lot of times people can be counted on to take that into account, to a degree. People have children and grandchildren. People understand that we have a certain obligation to the future. That obligation doesn't answer specific policy questions. It doesn't tell us, what level of taxation is the right one. But I think that it can be an important check on certain kinds of short-term thinking that can be damaging to the country.
So do you think the representative represents the future constituents or the current ones?
I think ultimately the representative is answerable to the current constituents. And, cares about the future to the extent they do, and the extent that all of us do.
Great. All right. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
Well, I think that a lot more of Congress's time should be devoted to committee work on substantive legislative development. And I think that some portion of that time should be committee work that is not televised or live streamed. Committees have to build in time for their members to work together, to get to know each other, to talk to each other. They should learn from the intelligence committees how valuable it can be to have some non-performative time in Congress. And if I could change the schedule, first of all, I think members should be around longer. They should try to have long stretches where they are in Washington, followed by long stretches where they are back home. And that a fair amount of that should be spent in committee working on bills.
So where do you come out on the home versus in DC question in terms of percentage?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think in some ways the percentage may be right now, except that we divide it up in such a way that members are here from Tuesday to the end of Thursday every week, and then they're home for a long weekend. And that means they aren't really in either place. They're always about to go somewhere. And I think that if we instead thought of it in terms of spending 4 or 5 weeks in Washington, then spending 4 or 5 weeks at home, it'd still be 50-50, but you'd be more present in both cases.
And how about the breakdown between the legislative aspects and the oversight aspects, or do you not put a distinction between them?
I think they're connected, but I would say that there ought to be more time spent on more traditional legislative work, and that, especially if we do somehow break down the barrier between authorizing and legislating, members would have an opportunity to specialize more in substantive policy areas, and then could also be more effective at oversight in those areas. But Congress's fundamental work is legislation, and I think that should come before oversight.
Got it. So the next one is something we discussed at length already, but give you a chance to kind of, summarize your thinking. How should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Yeah, well, as we said, I mean, I think the model of bargaining should be at the center of it, that the goal is to resolve differences by negotiation. And so not simply to talk over the other party and to overpower the other party, but ultimately to see that a conclusion will be arrived at by some form of compromise. It's obvious in theory, but it's plainly not obvious in practice to a lot of members, and I think that's the way to think about it.
All right, next one is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Yeah. I think one thing that's important is to begin to grow the House of Representatives again, in relation to the size of the population. This happened throughout the 19th century. After almost every census, the number of members in the House grew, so that the proportion of constituents to members stayed roughly the same. It hasn't happened now for more than 100 years, and it's time. It would help us to rebalance representation some, to rebalance the electoral college some. It would also create an opportunity for other sorts of reforms, budget reforms like we've talked about. So I think that's one important change that I would push for in the coming decades. It won't be easy. Members, who thrive in the current Congress don't feel like it needs to change, but I think it's important to help them see that.
What do you think the political consequences would be under such a change?
It's really unpredictable, and that's one of the nice things about it. It would not obviously help one party or the other, because it would allow the House to offer a more fine-grained representation in relation to the decennial census. And so there'd be advantages to both parties in different ways. And it's one of the reasons I think it has a shot.
Right. Next one is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I would say one of the greatest influences on me has been Francis Lee, the great political scientist now at Princeton, who tries to understand the modern Congress in its own terms, not just to think about it nostalgically and not just to think about it abstractly, but to ask what it is and what it does well and what it does poorly. I've learned a huge amount from the work that she does.
Great. Well, the last question here is the question about the future. What do you plan to work on? And, what, do you have any books in new books that you're working on, or, what's the, what are the future plans?
Well, when it comes to Congress in particular, my work is really focused now on electoral reform and on institutional reform, budget process, and a few other things. I'm part of a team at the American Enterprise Institute with Kevin Kosar and Philip Wallach, John Fortier, and others who are working on these questions. And I think there are a lot of interesting prospects to come. I am also at the beginning of a book about how to think about the American Constitution as a framework for accommodation in a divided society. Some of the issues that we've talked about here, ways of resolving differences by opening up arenas of contention and allowing tension to endure, but to drive change, thinking about the structure of the Constitution as a model for doing that. And so it's a kind of guide to the Constitution as a more than legal document, but as shaping a regime that ought to be able to live with its immense and growing diversity more constructively than we have so far.
Great. Well, Yuval, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks.